STEM Stories with Mr. Ewing. You know, big question. Where do you live? Now, a lot of us, when we answer this question, are going to say, I live in a house, or I live in an apartment, or I live in a building, or I live down at the corner of blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And that, while that is true, that's a physical, actual location. All of that is located in bigger areas called habitats. Now, habitats are everywhere, and every one of them is very different, uniquely different from the other habitats around the world. So you may be asking yourself, Mr. Ewing, well, what is an actual habitat? Habitats have a lot of different factors, but it's a natural environment located within the earth where animals, plants, and humans or other organisms all live. And there's a lot of factors that actually make up different habitats and make them uniquely different. Those are things like climate. Make sure we don't confuse climate with weather. Weather is what actually happens every day. Climate's what actually happens throughout the year. We have to look at the source of water. What water is actually located there or not located there. Geography. What's the land like? What's the terrain like? And the plants and animals and humans that actually live in those particular habitats. Now, how many habitats are there? And that really depends on who you're going to talk to. So for our presentation, we're going to talk about 8 habitats. Just as a side note, NASA actually lists 16 major habitats. We're only going to talk about 8 here. And some textbooks will only talk about 6. So you're wondering, what are those? Well, there's the polar habitat, the tundra habitat. There's the evergreen forest habitat, temperate forest habitat, grasslands, deserts, tropical rainforest, and the oceans. Our first habitat, we're going to talk about the polar habitat. Now, the polar habitat is super cold with very little sunlight or warmth from the sunlight during the summer and pretty much none in the winter months. That's one of the reasons it's very, very cold, a lot of ice, a lot of snow. The polar habitats are located at the top of our Earth, or what's considered the bottom of our Earth, or the south of the North Pole. Now, the major difference between the North and South Pole is that the North Pole is water surrounded by land, and the South Pole is land surrounded by water. And one of the biggest myths that I want to dispel right now is polar bears and penguins do not live in the same area. There was a very famous commercial that showed the two polar bears and penguins playing together until a lot of scientists kicked up a lot of stink and said, and that company actually corrected that commercial. So the polar habitat looks a lot like this. There's a lot of snow, a lot of ice, and a lot of really, really cold water. And then up in our North Pole, we've got our polar bears and a lot of ice and still a lot of water and a lot of snow. And although those polar bears look super cute, they are super dangerous because they are not super friendly. They're actually big time predators. And then we've got our penguins living down in the South Pole. Never the two shall meet. So our next habitat we're going to talk about is the tundra. The reason we talk about the tundra next is that it is very similar to the polar habitat, except it actually has signs of life in the summer. It warms up to a certain amount of warmer temperature where some of the snow will actually melt down, and signs of life, very quick growing plants will sprout and grasses will come up and then die off or actually go into hibernation in the winter because the winter months are really cold and those plants can't survive. So our tundra kind of looks like this in the summer, where we've got the plants that start to grow, the snow melts a little bit, and then we'll come back in the winter months. But the summer, it actually looks like nice green fields. And we have a number of animals that live in that vegetation or eat the vegetation for those summer months. Now, our next habitat is our evergreen forest that is connected directly to the tundra habitat. Now, one of the reasons it's called an evergreen forest, it's mainly filled with conifer type trees that stay green all year, evergreen. They don't lose their leaves. They tend to have thinner leaves that can actually survive the cold winters. These areas tend to be around Russia, Europe, Canada, but on the fringes around the edges of our tundra. it looks a lot like a normal forest, except for the fact that we don't have the deciduous trees, those trees that turn different colors in the fall. Mainly our evergreens, and then we have some of our local animals that live in this type of habitat. So that brings us to the temperate forest, which is connected very similar or close to our evergreen forest, but this is the type of forest that actually changes colors, or what we perceive as those forests that change colors. It has a different type of climate. It tends to be wet and dry. It runs through the seasons, so we have spring, summer, fall, and winter in these temperate forests. And that's one of the reasons you start to get the deciduous trees, just trees that will lose their leaves in the fall and the winter, and change those colors that we love to go see. A lot of the forests that we probably know in this area of the country, I'm up in the Northeast, tend to be those temperate type forests. Those forests that we see, those park trees around us, tend to be the temperate type of forests. And a lot of the natural animals that live around there, like squirrels, some of my favorites to see. That brings us next to our grassland habitats. Now, as you would assume, grassland habitats tend to be areas with a lot of grass. So it warms up enough for the plants to grow, but it doesn't get too hot or hot enough for trees. That's why when we see pictures of grassland areas, we don't see trees. These conditions tend to be very hot to very cold and can be very dry. Again, it gets too hot for trees in the summer, so we don't see the trees actually growing in this habitat. A lot of our images of giraffes and zebras out in the field tend to be grassland habitats. So if you notice, there's a few little tiny trees that grow in this habitat, but not like a forest that we're used to. And they have to be trees that can actually survive the very, very hot climates in the summer of this habitat. That takes us next to deserts. What difference the grasslands from the desert is the desert has even less water in this area. And contrary to what we think, deserts can actually be really, really cold. They're not necessarily all hot all year long. They just tend to be super, super dry. And the plants and animals that live in this habitat have to be able to adapt to these conditions. So a lot of the images that we think of the desert are exactly what we think. A lot of sand, very little plant life, plants that have to be able to retain water in order to survive, and animals that actually can adapt to the extreme temperatures that are found in the desert areas. That takes us to one of my favorite habitats, the tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest is very, very damp, dense forests. There's a lot of rain, full of light, and the warmth from the sun. These areas tend to be the center, the equator area of our Earth. And because of those conditions, they are filled with all kinds of vegetation and animal life, a lot that we still have yet to even discover. Some of the most beautiful areas, in my opinion, on Earth. Lots of green, lots of wet, lots of damp conditions, lots of really cool reptiles and snakes, and just some really cool animals to be found in the rainforest. Now, this takes us to the ocean habitats. Probably the least explored habitats of all habitats on Earth. And as you would know, that the water or the oceans cover 71% of the Earth's surface. That's a lot. That means only about a third of the Earth's surface is actual land, all the other habitats. Now, plant life within these actually varies depending on the depth, the locations, the warmth of the water, the currents. It has a lot of different factors. A lot of these plants float because they can't actually put roots down into the bottom like a normal plant would do. So there's a lot of different conditions, and then plant or animal life or our aquatic life varies very differently depending on where these locations are around the world. Temperature, depth, all kinds of things factored, and it's one of the reasons we just haven't explored as much as we've explored everywhere else on Earth. But some of the most colorful and beautiful of the habitats I would love to explore. It's one of the habitats that I have yet to explore, and some really cool, interesting places. So I wonder, in which habitat do you live? And I will tell you, I live in New York City. When I look around, I think, what kind of habitat do I actually live in? That would be considered one of those urban habitats. But before the city was actually built, this was a tempered forest habitat. We have just, over the years, cleared a lot of the forest out to make way for places for humans to live. And that's a whole nother story that we can talk about. But look around. Try to study and learn about the habitats around you, and then learn about all the other habitats in the world. Have some fun and enjoy